Колеги, продовжуємо.
Esteemed colleagues, we continue the series of press briefings. Now I would like to invite the expert, Mr. Oleh Havrylyshyn. Mr. Havrylyshyn is Canadian economist of Ukrainian origin. He was holding high positions in the IMF, and starting from this year, Mr. Havrylyshyn is the member of the Advisory Council at the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. And together with other European international experts, they are developing recommendations for Ukrainian government on conducting reforms, on implementing reforms. Now, Mr. Havrylyshyn will talk about what advice for the government, the Advisory Council developed, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about quite critical issues for our country, economic reforms. I'm starting from saying that when I come from Canada, I cannot but bring some small souvenir, which would be great after lunch. You know, in Canada, there's such a great thing as maple syrup, of which different candies are made. So I offered this to our friends, journalists, either now or afterwards, to open this box, please. As you know, besides the Canadian government has already given many gifts to Ukraine, and that is my personal small gift. Allow me to briefly say what this Advisory Economic Council is. It started after Maidan, from March or April. The Canadian government allocated money for different types of assistance, technical assistance as well, and one of the elements which was started at the request, and that started at the request of the Minister Sherimeta, that was to form the group of economic advisors on issues which reforms are needed and how to implement them. So we started first meetings with Minister Sherimeta back in May, and since then we have been here many times. From Canada, that's myself and Vasil Halimon. Besides, there's a famous Swedish-American economist, Aslund. He's at the Peterson Institute, and also Kaha Bendukidze, who spoke here, the former Minister of Economy of Georgia, first years after the Revolution of Roses. So we were working depending on the needs. This is the bilateral framework. When we see what are the most important issues which are to be addressed, we come up with initiative. But also from the other side, we get requests to consider this or that issue. Ukrainian party has expanded now. This time, for example, we met with the presidential administration, Mr. Shimkiv, who heads the issue of economic reforms with the Prime Minister. We also had meetings with his assistants, also with his people who work on economic reforms. in the Committee of Support of Reforms and the Semerak, other people with the governor of the National Bank, with the people from the Ministry of Finance, and besides we had meetings with the civil society groups, package of reforms or new country, or some other people who are in the Kiev Mahila Academy. So that's the explanation about how we work. What issues have we been considering and what are our recommendations? Starting from the first visit, we are communicating between ourselves by Skype before we come here, and we decide on what should be the agenda, what issues are to be worked on.
Zápisy.
And first, we concentrated on issues of reforms, institutional reforms, especially reforms, regulatory reforms. I will put it directly, which stop and which hamper and slow down the process of development of small and medium-sized business, different regulations, different inspections, how to start a new business. Well, this is clear that here this is one of the worst elements in Ukrainian economic policy, as the indicators of different international organizations show. Transparency International from Berlin puts a rating to Ukraine which is not the best one. Out of 180 countries, Ukraine is in the last years at a very high level. It was 165, now it probably improved a little bit. We are holding 150th position. Also, there's such a quantitative indicator, and that's annual report on doing business that the World Bank prepares. I had to run up from Maidan, so I'm sorry. Doing business report also gives quite a bad rating for Ukraine. Now we improved from 140 to 112. What happens when the next report is issued? We do not know. But it depends on how they will look at these changes that are taking place. Also, what stimulated us in June, in July, it looked like something was being done, but very little was being done. And that's nothing new for you, because a lot has been said about that by people who are interested. Why so little was done in such a short period of time? I will answer later why nothing more has been done. So we underscoring the principles. When the doors open, when there is a new opportunity, when the window of opportunity opens, then you need to make use of that and do as much as possible in the beginning. That's the experience of the reforms in the 90s of Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. So we emphasize that we need to do quickly as much as possible, and that way we kill two birds with one stone, because it improves the investment climate, it helps small business, and secondly, that is the signal to the whole nation and to the foreign environment. And briefly, I will, in the end, would like to say that this time when we came, and we had several meetings this week, but this time we decided to shift our accent a little bit, because reviewing the situation and different macroeconomic indicators, including those which are in the latest analysis of the IMF, we believed that the budgetary macroeconomic situation has worsened a lot in the last 3 months, more than we expected when the standby was provided in April. It's much worse than it was expected, but their report says that the situation deteriorated. We need to introduce some changes. We give new parameters, and the first review is fine. Okay, we give the tranche, and very often in the international experience, that may have some negative consequences. The political leaders, the government, they take it as a signal. Okay, IMF says the review is fine, we have the second tranche, and everything's fine. But in fact, it's not fine. If you read it in detail, then this report of the IMF in its appendices has quite a clear signal that it may deteriorate. So we emphasize that, and we suggested to the government the following strategy. Now we are in a very critical situation. There is this external threat. There's the state of war. So now we can base our policy on new programs for the next year, not on the best case scenario, but on the worst case scenario. If we hope that the worst case will not develop, but there is a big risk that the best scenario will not work out either. So we need both, the best case and the worst case scenario. So that is the message that we left with the government. We need to look attentively at that, and we need to do more than was programmed to be ready for deterioration. Okay, I believe that I will stop on that. And now, if you have questions, I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Any questions? I have a question. Are you discussing any innovative drivers of development? Does anyone talk about innovations in the ministry? Yes, we do discuss it. We don't pay a lot of attention to that. Maybe we are wrong, but our view is that innovation, development opportunities are for medium and long term. Now in Ukraine, there are so many critical issues that we pay attention to those. Besides, most of the economists always look at that in such a way and answers in such a way. If the state is interested in stimulation of economic development, and the state should be interested in that, especially in such countries as Ukraine, which is lagging behind compared to Poland, for example. When Poland and Ukraine were at more or less same level, I'm talking about standard of life 25 years ago, but now in Poland the GDP per capita is 3 times higher than in Ukraine. But if the state is doing it, the best way to stimulate is open the opportunities for innovators, for medium, small businesses, but not subsidize them by different laws, customs tariffs, or do not give them direct support. So that is, for us, also very important recommendation how to treat that. And besides, for a short term, there are so many critical issues that they are to be addressed. And in the end, I would like to say, when there is such a crisis, little can be done to stimulate investments. Before I came here, I talked to my colleague from old times, and he's the specialist on transformations, post-communist transformations, William Boyta, who was the chief economist in the EBRD in London, and now he's the chief economist in a small private group which is called Citigroup. And I asked him, can anything be done to get foreign investors interested? He says,
Поки відбувається така непевна.
while we have such unclear situation, who will be thinking about putting money into Ukraine? And I'm not sure that that is absolutely true, but that's the general trend.
I have a question on behalf of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. They say that the wartime is not the best time for implementing reforms. What is your opinion when Ukraine is not in security position today, and whether this is the right time for implementing reforms? And the second question, what is your evaluation of the Ukrainian government, whether it is successful in reform implementation? The first question is a bit easier than the second one. I believe that this situation is absolutely the best time for the reforms. This is the time of crisis. Independent of the reasons of the crisis, whether it is the wartime or any other types of crisis, nevertheless, this is the best time for reforms. Why? Because people in any country where they should tighten up the belts, where you should recall all the social welfare programs, where you have to cut down something and raise prices. people in any case won't be happy, but in crisis they won't lose too much. For example, gas prices. The raising gas tariffs is a rather painful issue, but when people find themselves in crisis, they understand easily that the government cannot make ends meet, and that the government is unable to continue with the social welfare programs. On the other hand, after Maidan fighting, people understand that one of the best strives of Maidan was to reach Europe, but Europe doesn't mean the value per se. It means great changes in the economic structure and in economic policy. And what I heard from people, what I read in newspapers, what I understood from my interviews with people, with my relatives, with other people from diaspora in Canada and America, I understood that people are more prepared to the radical reforms. And just one element of those reforms, these are gas prices. From the very beginning, the gas prices and attitude of people to the gas prices in those countries like Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia, this issue was resolved back in 1990s when the global gas prices grew and the gas prices in those countries also grew up. And those countries depend very much on Russian gas. The issue whether to raise gas tariffs for poor people, for whom this will be a rather difficult situation. Trying to keep gas tariffs low, you not only support poor people, but you also provide support for those who have sufficient means for paying their gas bills. That's why the gas tariffs go up even more sharply than people expected. And those people whose income is lower than some threshold, then for those people, the losses are compensated by the state. That is, this is targeted assistance. The second question was about the progress in reforms implementation. It's not so easy to answer this question. It's easier to state that it was done lesser than one could expected. And what was done? Among successes are the state law on the law on state procurement, on public procurement. This law contains some problem issues, but it is passed and it works. There is a cut down of personnel, both in governmental agencies and in the National Bank in Ukraine. And the NBU is cutting down its personnel more successfully than other governmental agencies. But this is done with a much lower speed than one could expect. Another question is whether it is possible to do it more intensively. Frankly speaking, I would like to see it done more effectively, and nevertheless, I understand that there is a rather tough situation now, especially with the war in the east, and that the major attention of the president is devoted to the more existential issues. Whether we could expect that the reforms will progress and will deepen, yes, we should expect for this. But keeping in mind that Verkhovna Rada is not the body through which the laws can pass quickly and easily. And you witnessed this several days ago when some very important laws has passed through Verkhovna Rada, while some other important legislation was not passed. And quite often, governmental bureaucrats mention that they are very much limited by Verkhovna Rada, although they are not limited by 100%. I keep to stay optimistic. I was in the first government of Ukraine, and I understand clearly that things takes time, and I'm a bit disappointed with the pace of reforms. But as of today, at least we have people in the government who do not do everything possible, but nevertheless there are people who are very much committed to reform and who are very much committed to the idea of European integration of Ukraine. That's why I stay optimistic, and I feel the major disappointment in the fact that as of the moment we do not have Verkhovna Rada up to the snap elections. We do not have the Verkhovna Rada, which is fully effective. I believe that people should keep patience and should wait for some month during which the new forces will strengthen and start the more insistent movement towards reform. What you mentioned the gas tariffs. Would you please mention what gas tariff or gas price is the most well-grounded, and how much it could be raised for population? I won't speak deeply about the technical parameters, because those technical parameters are not sure as of the moment.
Перерахунок, який
But automatic recalculation with an account of today's prices, of the global prices, with the levels of consumption. I don't think this is the right approach for an economist. For an economist, the right approach is that demand should change the price in different sectors of the economy.
Do two examples. When the prices go up, the people will use a little less. That will be the saving. Secondly, you increase the prices, and it gives you the incentive for quick development of gas resources which are in the subsoil. We know that there are reserves, but for the price which is low, there's no economic, it's not economically profitable to extract the gases. And I can tell you so that the price for gas today, even with the increase by 15%, the price for gas in Ukraine today is just a quarter of what our neighbors to the west have. Besides, don't forget that they were increasing prices for gas within the period of 6 or 8 months. There was a radical increase that they did, and they survived. So it's not, it is possible. I don't say that that should be done 100% increasing up to the world prices, but we need to do that quickly to remove all the subsidies. We calculate it so that it's the level of 10% of the GDP. That is the state deficit. If you add to that the direct budgetary deficit, so basically we need to think about reducing it within 2-3 years. So basically we need to calculate what would be the gas price. I wouldn't be against that personally, but I understand that the advisor is advising, but the one who's implementing is deciding, and not everything that the advisor advises fits for everyone. In order to increase it by 25-30% every year, it looks quite possible. Any more questions? Then I would like to ask, can you give us an example of the country which would be in the state of war and would implement efficient reforms? Croatia, Armenia, even in times of 2008, Georgia, they had civil war, even though we know that wasn't actually the civil war. They were implementing bigger reforms than what we have seen in Ukraine. I would like to draw your attention. You're asking about experience. One of the elements that we are working on, and I do a lot of that, we need to disseminate the knowledge about how that was happening in the Central Europe, compared to how it was happening in the former Soviet Union. I was lecturing about that at the Kyiv Mahila Academy, for the students and graduates. But I will make a little advertisement. I wrote a book in English in 2006, which was translated into Ukrainian, Capitalism for Everyone, or Capitalism for Selected Ones. That's not just Ukraine, but 25 countries. That is published by Kiev Mahila Academy Publishing House, which again, this book has become topical because people are interested in that. I'm lecturing about that for the second time, and I see that people are very much interested how that was done in many countries. But also it impresses me when I hear these words, because these words remind me of what I've heard from political leaders in the first years of independence. And at that time I was the insider, I worked in the government, and I realized quickly and very well that these words are like a curtain that covered real motivations. The motivations of our leaders and probably up to today's. That is the story of reforms of all the administrations, including Yanukovych. The leaders, especially in the beginning, had in mind only one thing: let's not hurry up with reforms because we need time to paint us from red to green. Because in Ukraine there was no lustration like in many countries of Central Europe. Because in Ukraine there was no lustration, then a certain group of communists stayed there, and for them the main interest was I want to stay as economic elite. How to do that? Should I go back to the Soviet Union? It's impossible and I don't want to. How this should be done? I will be one of new capitalists. So just give me time to find the opportunity to become capitalist. I will not be talking about history. Not all politicians, the former communists of the first government of Ukraine, became good capitalists. Some of them have become capitalists. So these words impress me, and they remind me of the words about slow reforms, which explain why the reforms are slow. Many political leaders were explaining why the reforms are slow, like Prime Minister Fokin was saying, people are not ready to go to get to the market. Who he meant? I believe he means people, but those who understand, they realize that people who are not ready to get to the market were his friends. Once there are no more questions, I would like to thank Mr. Oleh Havrylyshyn for his experience, for sharing it with us. Thank you. And we'll be waiting for you in Ukrainian Crisis Center with new recommendations. At 3 o'clock, we will have another press briefing. There will be the